Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a great show planned for this evening. Colin Aro is here. We're going to talk about mountain flying. For those of you who might be planning a great trip this summer flying, especially since AirVenture's canceled and many of us are looking for a different adventure, you might want to think about going out west, and Colin's going to prepare us a little bit for mountain flying. Really, really looking forward to that. This show was created, we created SocialFlight Live to help everyone and support General Aviation during the pandemic. And, we haven't been able to fly even over the past few days here in New England. The weather's been pretty poor with low IFR ceilings and thunderstorms and all the things that little airplanes like we fly are not good for. And so during that time, one of the things we've been able to do, which is really good, is experience I guess some of the benefits during this very difficult time of things that you can do as an alternative to getting out there and flying. And my fiance Heidi likes to call it the gift, one of the gifts of COVID. And that is that even during this crisis, during so many bad things going on, there are some wonderful opportunities that also come up that otherwise wouldn't be there. Wouldn't you have this opportunity to speak with all of you during this show? And the other thing that's really great is my boys and I have been working so hard on this project behind me that you can see our Titan T51D Mustang. And I just wanted to share, and I'll open up the, share the picture here for you. And, we've got this project going on. We've been able to complete so much more work, and you can follow it online. Just go to SocialFlight's YouTube channel. For those of you, I just got a question coming in. If you are looking at the picture and you want to be able to see the slides bigger or the video smaller, there's a bar that you can just grab there on your screen and drag to change the size on the screen of what you're looking at. So you can control it that way, and we'll try to control when we have the webcams on and when we're just showing things on the screen. But anyway, just to get back to this, if you'd like to follow our build, it's been this really wonderful opportunity to go out there and spend a lot of time working together. We made some great progress on this Titan Mustang. It's such a cool project, such a wonderful family bonding activity that we've been able to do. And of course, it's right here in my office behind me in our house here outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And if you take a look at this, you can actually see some interesting things. We're going to have some upcoming videos showing our work. We went over to a company called Fabco that does a lot of work on other aerospace projects that I do with them. And we're able to use their laser machine. We cut doors, we put in, that's near upper right of your screen. You can see our smoke oil door. Can't have a Mustang without being able to lay down some smoke in the sky. And so we've completed some of that work. Our baggage doors in your lower left, a lot of parts coming together, and you can follow all of this again on our YouTube channel online. And we've released a couple new videos recently about working on the belly of the aircraft, and including one that's out there with, you can see Jake and Ben there, a little bit of a competition they had with different tools and working with Clecos. And send in your comments, because we have the opportunity, if you are interested in having an episode where we just go through this build and talk to you about it, bring the camera over to the aircraft and kind of have some interactive stuff on that. If that's interesting to you, send us your request. We'll be sure to factor that into the rest of the work and the rest of the project that we're doing. So I'm absolutely open to doing that, and we can get ahead with that. With that, I would like to introduce Colin Aro. Colin is a good friend of mine. He holds a BA in Applied Mathematics from UC Berkeley, a PhD in engineering from UC Davis. He's a commercial pilot and flight instructor. He's rated in single-engine airplanes, multi-engine airplanes, and gliders. He is also a fast team representative working out of the Reno FSDO, and he specializes in mountain flying safety. That is why he is here with us tonight. He's an operations officer with the High Sierra Squadron of the Commemorative Air Force, and he oversees operations of the squadron's N3, N3, and L-19 aircraft. He flies and performs with the Northern California Beach Boys Formation Demonstration Team, lives in Reno, Nevada with his wife and son, and I would just like to welcome Colin to the presentation at this time. I'm going to switch off my webcam here so you can see your screen just a little bit better. Colin, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm such a huge fan of the SocialFlight app. It's always given me good tips on things to do, places to go, stuff in aviation. So thanks for all the work you do.
Oh, thank you so much for doing that. And again, we're going to have a little bit of a different format tonight because I've asked Colin to come on and give a version of some of the presentations he's given about safely flying, doing mountain flying, especially with so many people who may be flatlanders like myself heading out west, and we are going to be doing a trip like that. So we're going to need to see that.
Well, that's no. This is my favorite talk to give. Because I mean, well, two reasons. It's an important topic. If you look at the NAL report released by the AOPA Air Safety Foundation every year, mountain airports have an accident rate that's nearly triple that of flatland airports. So it's an important topic. And my whole career, whether it's my academic career, my engineering career, or my flying, I've always enjoyed crossing disciplines. And so when I moved to the Sierra Nevada, I added my glider ratings. I always knew a lot about soaring because my brother-in-law is a glider pilot and has been since he's 16. So I knew a lot about it, but it wasn't until I moved to the Reno area and added the privileges that I started doing a lot of soaring, and it really changed my take on the topic. And so I look at it, I like to approach the topic through the eyes of a glider pilot, because the rationale is that if glider pilots out here in the Eastern Sierra can reach up into the flight levels for altitude and accomplish cross countries of hundreds of miles, where then light airplane pilots can apply those same techniques and that same knowledge and abilities to make themselves not only safer, but maybe perhaps more efficient pilots flying in the mountain environment.
Makes so much sense. And when we think about mountains, of course, the big ones are out by you, but I think it matters no matter what, because we've got mountains that are you'd consider to be, probably hills at best. And you get a good breeze going, and you're going to an airport that's just at the base of one. You better know what you're doing.
No, that's absolutely correct. And yeah, just because it's not that big of a mountain, it's not the Sierra Nevada, doesn't mean some of these same forces aren't still at work. So that's an excellent point. So yeah, this is a really different format for me, but I wanted to start off just by outlining a couple of rules here to keep us safe around the big terrain. And these are right out of Sparky Imeson's book, The Mountain Flying Bible. So I want to start off by defining the point of no return. When you're flying into rising terrain, of course, the terrain can outclimb the aircraft. And so we define this point of no return as the point where you could reduce the power to idle and still make a safe 180-degree turnaround. So in other words, it's the point where you could lose the engine and not have a totally bad day. So having defined the point of no return, we can define two what I call house rules, and these were actually Sparky's rules. Rule number one, common sense, always be in a position to turn toward lowering terrain. And rule number two, never fly past the point of no return. So if you stick to these two simple rules, you're probably going to be okay. And I always like to point out that a Cessna 172 at full gross weight has a 9-to-1 glide ratio. Now in the glider world, we refer to something like that as a lawn dart, but that's only an 11% grade or a 6.3 degree descent angle. So if you can find terrain that's descending that steeply, you're not really losing any altitude in terms of your height AGL. Now that's not exactly comforting, but it is something. You can buy yourself some time by turning toward lowering terrain. So that's just a brief couple of rules to keep us safe. The next two things I'd like to talk about are density, altitude, and aircraft performance, and mountain weather. And the way I approach these two topics is I like to look at density, altitude as and aircraft performance as what we've got to work with. And with regard to mountain weather, I like to concentrate on vertical convection, the effects that certain weather phenomena have on vertical convection. And the philosophy there is what we're up against. So what we have to work with versus what we're up against. So for mountain airports, at least where I live, we typically have two of the three ingredients necessary for high density altitude. We're high up, and we certainly have hot days in the summers. To be totally honest, we don't get a whole lot of humidity where I live. It's not uncommon to see single-digit humidity, but 2 out of 3 isn't bad. And South Lake Tahoe on a hot summer day routinely has density altitudes of 8,000 feet and above. So high density altitude means low density in terms of mass per unit volume in the air.
You know, one
So,
thing, Colin, that I think is kind of interesting is, as pilots, we learn a lot about calculating our density altitude based on altitude and temperature. You know, humidity doesn't usually play as much of a factor, but from my experience, again, I've seen humidity, the effects of really high humidity are massive in terms of the actual lift the wing can actually provide. And I understand certainly in the mountains you don't necessarily have a lot of humidity, but it depends where those mountains are, I suppose.
yeah, you know, that's a good point you bring up, and I'm glad you brought that up because I tend to dismiss high humidity because we almost never have it out here in Reno. But the times I've visited Massachusetts, boy, the humidity really does get to me. So it's a good point.
Well,
It's not just.
I've done trips where you go down through the Smoky Mountains, for example, down towards the south. If I've gone down to visit one of my friend Paul Morrell, let's say down their park down outside Atlanta, you follow that mountain chain as you go down, and many of the let's put it politely and say many of the airports that just happen to have the least expensive gas happen to be at the top of some of those mountains. Happen to be mountains that I visit on the way down. And the Blue Ridge and that whole area can get quite humid. And so even though you may be at 3,000 feet to where the altitude for the airport is, that doesn't really seem like much. But if now it's 85 degrees and 90% humidity.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's an excellent point. High density altitude is high density altitude. That's all there is to it. And high density altitude means low air density. So speaking of air density, I'm talking about the physics definition of density, mass per unit volume. And the only thing I want people to take away from this slide is the relationship between the lift that an airfoil produces, its airspeed, and the air's density, the air's mass per unit volume. So the lift that we produce is proportional to the air's density. You cut the density in half, you cut the lift in half, all things being equal. And it's also proportional to the square of the airspeed. So if you double the square of the airspeed, you double the lift. And doubling the square of the airspeed amounts to increasing the airspeed itself by about 41%. The square root of 2 is 1.41. So I just wanted to point out the relationship between those quantities, because if you cut the air density in half, say like at 18,000 feet, you're going to have to double the square of the airspeed to keep all things equal, to generate the same amount of lift. So if you had a theoretical airport up at 18,000 feet density altitude, you would need to attain a true airspeed that's 41% higher in order to break ground than you would at sea level. So it's really significant. You're gonna notice it. And you know, now it's a contrived example. I picked 18,000 feet because the density is half what it is at sea level. But if you do the same analysis for South Lake Tahoe with a density altitude of 8 to 10,000 feet, the difference in true airspeed is about 10 to 15%. So you're going to notice it. The sight picture is going to be different, the pitch attitude, and the runway markers are going to go by a lot faster. It's instead of going by at Duke of Earl, they're going to be going by like La Bamba. So it really is noticeable. You got to get the wing to a higher true airspeed in order to generate enough lift to get off the ground. Fortunately, the indicated airspeed is the same, but it's a different sight picture, and all the more reason to go get a thorough mountain checkout with a qualified CFI before you really get into the terrain. So the wing has to get to a higher true airspeed to generate sufficient lift to get off the ground. And it's being pulled by a significantly weakened engine. The rule of thumb here is you're going to lose about 3% of your available power per 1,000 feet. And those of us that have manifold pressure gauges see this directly. My Comanche loses about an inch per 1,000 feet, and that's about 3%. So at 10,000 feet, your 180 horsepower Cessna engine is only putting out 126 horsepower. So the wing needs a higher true airspeed. It's being dragged there by a weakened engine, and the propeller, being an airfoil just like the wing, does a less efficient job at translating the engine's horsepower into forward thrust. So it really is a triple whammy. Things are ganging up on us. And if you've never seen it up close, it's an eye-opener. The book value on a Piper Arrow at 8 to 10,000 foot density altitude gives you an immediate rate of climb after takeoff of a little over 300 feet per minute. So if you've never seen that, it is an eye-opener. And the other thing to bear in mind there when looking at those book numbers is those numbers were obtained with a brand new aircraft being flown by a test pilot. And so your mileage may vary. So things really gang up on you, and the only way to combat it is to lighten the load. My first airplane was a Grumman Traveler, and I used to joke that it was a great airplane out west here for a young couple who was childless. Because it's, even though it's a 4-seat airplane, when you take it out into the mountains and the high density altitude, it becomes a 2-seat airplane. And the only way to combat this problem is by lightening the load. You can only carry 2 people, and you don't skimp on emergency supplies or water or fuel, but consider every pound you put on board the aircraft, and bear in mind your takeoff distance is proportional to the square of your gross weight. So if you add 10% to your gross weight, that's going to increase your takeoff roll by 21%. So every pound counts. And once you get into the air, that's only the beginning of the battle. You've really got to think about your climb gradient and account for time and fuel that you might need to circle. And one thing to bear in mind, another thing to bear in mind, is that the air in the immediate vicinity of the ridge lines may be much, much warmer than standard due to radiative heating. So if you're crossing a ridge at 10,000 feet MSL, the density altitude of the air in the immediate vicinity of that ridge might be 12 to 14,000 feet because the temperature is so much warmer than standard. I actually have an anecdote here. I was taking off from a California airport back in the 90s, a place called Ruth that's closed now. But everything was normal, and I started to run out of available runway and barely got out of ground effect. And so I sidestepped over to a river that was next to the runway, and I got a nice climb once I got over the water. And when I got enough altitude to make my turnaround, I saw exactly what had happened. The runway had just been repaved. It was jet black. And so the density altitude of the air right over that runway was much, much higher than anywhere else on the airport.
So Colin, let's talk about that for a second. So a couple different things, like you mentioned.
Okay.
So the ground itself and the different types of terrain that you fly over have a direct impact on the performance of the aircraft when you're dealing with high altitude and high density altitude, based on things like you just said, jet black, newly paved runway, saving yourself by going over a water basically, which you know is going to be a lot cooler. And then and can you explain also the tops of mountains being getting warmer and therefore raising the density altitude compared to the density altitude you were at before you get to that mountain peak?
Exactly. Yeah, this is the point that I'm trying to make is you can't fool physics. You can't cheat physics. The airplane is going to know exactly what the density altitude is, and it's going to perform accordingly. So just bear that in mind. The air in the immediate closeness to the terrain could be much, much warmer than standard temperature.
And are we, like, I know later on the presentation we're going to talk about exit strategies and things like that, but I mean, that's an interesting exit strategy I hadn't actually thought about, which involves looking not just at the terrain for altitude, but looking at the terrain for temperature.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, the bottom line here is if you've never seen it, your aircraft's performance may just be shockingly poor. It's a real eye-opener when you experience it for the first time. As I said, I like to look at weather as what we're up against. we know that our airplane's performance is going to be really anemic. Let's see what the atmosphere is potentially going to do to us. And I'll start off by just talking about thermals, as glider pilots call them. Thermals are just columns of rising air caused by differential heating on the terrain. And they're quite often topped off with flat bottom cumulus clouds, although you have certainly blue sky thermal days where there are no clouds at all. And glider pilots use these things as stepping stones on cross-country flights. You gain a bunch of altitude and then blast off to the next thermal, gain a bunch more altitude, and so on and so forth. So out in the Eastern Sierra, these thermals can be very, very robust. And if we look at, let's see, we have an instrument panel here coming up. The picture on the left is a photograph of my hairy knees. And you can see the glider's instrument panel on the upper, in the very bottom middle, you can see my altimeter. And it's hard to see all three hands, but that's actually 13,100 feet, not 3,100 feet. In the upper left is my airspeed, which is right around the best glide speed for that glider. But the interesting thing is that in the upper right-hand instrument, that's a variometer. It's the glider equivalent of a VSI. You'll notice that I'm wings level underneath a line or a street of cumulus clouds, and my rate of climb is about 750, a little bit short of 800 feet a minute. So if your climb rate in your Piper Arrow is only 310 feet a minute, it would be great to boost it by another 750 a minute if you know where to look for it. So these thermals can really help us out a lot. The problem is it's rising air. Thermals are very often predictable, and you can definitely use them to your advantage. But there are a couple of points to be made here. First of all, where there's lifting air, there's also sinking air. So if you've got air going up at 1,000 feet a minute, you're going to find downdrafts of 1,000 feet a minute somewhere else. So if you don't know what you're doing, it may not be the wisest thing. The other thing is that, yeah, it's rising air, but it's turbulent rising air. And so the best advice that I can give is to get airborne at dark 30 and be in the swimming pool at your destination by lunchtime, and avoid the worst of these thermals, because passengers can find them really uncomfortable. They can sure boost your performance, but a funny story, oddly enough, just this week I realized that the very first time I put these slides together was for the Baraboo AYA convention in 2004, I think it was. And on the way home from that, we had a really rough mountain flight from Elko to Reno Stead. And my son, who was 6 at the time, was with us. And he's been flying since a week old, and so he's got an iron stomach. But on final approach to Reno Stead, he yelled into the microphone, "Oh, Dad, I'm going to throw up." And so, you know, it's probably best to fly early in the day and not bother your passengers with these thermals. Anyway, but they are out there. So the other thing I wanted to mention in terms of quote-unquote weather is mechanical lift, and we'll start off with so-called ridge lift, and this is just wind blowing over a ridge line. And if you picture this happening in a stream, water flowing over a log, well, you're going to expect lifting air on the windward side of the ridge and descending air on the leeward side. Now, here's something glider pilots know that most airplane pilots don't find obvious right away, but 1 knot is 100 feet per minute. Nautical miles, about 6,000 feet per 60 minutes, 100 feet a minute. So a gentle breeze can actually do a lot if it's deflected. You take a 5-knot breeze and deflect it straight up, that's a column of rising air going up at 500 feet a minute. Even a 10-knot breeze deflected at a 45-degree angle. Unfortunately, I got to throw a little math at you, but the sine and cosine of 45 degrees are about 0.7. So that 10 knot degrees deflected up at a 45-degree angle is going to have a 700 foot per minute vertical component. So if you deflect it in the right direction, a gentle breeze can do a lot. And if you don't have a weather reporting station, you're out in the middle of the mountains and you don't know which direction the wind is blowing, you can certainly use the aircraft's crab angle as a clue. So, so yeah, the whole point of this slide is just if you deflect it the right way or the wrong way, a gentle breeze can do you a lot of good or bad. So when the wind really picks up, we have the potential for something called mountain wave, and I'd like to jokingly refer to this as ridge lift's muscular cousin. So the conditions for mountain wave formation are twofold. You first of all need a stable layer, a stable atmosphere, and you need a couple of conditions on the wind. Go ahead and advance the slide. So the wind has to be within 20 or 30 degrees of perpendicular to the ridge line. It has to have a constant wind direction as you increase in altitude. And that's a little bit unusual because of the Coriolis effect. Normally, as we go higher and higher, the wind bends more and more to the right. And the last thing you need is a speed gradient. So what you see here are the wind aloft forecast for the day I took the photograph in this slide. And we've got all our conditions met. We had a stable atmosphere this day. This is the eastern ridgeline of Lake Tahoe, which runs roughly north-south. So you can see the wind aloft are 250 degrees. That's within 20 degrees of perpendicular to the ridgeline. And that 250 degree heading or direction stays constant all the way up to about 30,000 feet. And so, and also we've got a speed gradient, 15 knots, 18 knots at 10,000 feet, 25 knots, increasing monotonically as we go up in altitude. And so our wind conditions have been met. And when I saw this forecast, I dropped what I was doing, grabbed my Nikons, and went out and did a bunch of photography and got this picture. So waves can be pretty predictable, but they're also really, really powerful. And here's a shot. This is just a panoramic taken from about 20,000 feet of a wave system over the Reno-Carson area. And on the left-hand side, you've got a classic cap cloud. And then the air descends, compresses, and heats, and the moisture goes away. That's a classic Föhn gap there. You've got the rotor or roll clouds down at the lower levels, and what looks to be about a 50-mile long sheet of lenticular clouds at the upper levels. And at the upper levels, it's actually quite smooth. All the turbulence is down near the cap or the roll clouds.
I always thought that the lenticular clouds were something to be very, very wary of. Is that because of what you've got down lower? Is because they indicate that you're going to have the rolling ones down lower, Colin?
That's right, and that was, I don't know if it still is, that was a written question on the FAA exam, was that lenticulars imply turbulence, extreme turbulence possibly.
Right.
And that's true, but it's down at the lower levels. The lenticulars themselves are actually very, very smooth. Yeah, so it's just down at the lower levels where a typical GA airplane would be flying.
Fascinating. So they're warning you essentially of lenticular clouds, and as you mentioned during the exam, I remember seeing that. But it's again about the idea of flying underneath them because of what it implies happens underneath them.
That's exactly true. It's what goes on underneath it. And you can think of the rotor cloud. I always thought of the lenticulars as a conveyor belt, and the rotor clouds were like the rollers.
Fascinating.
So yeah, so that's where all the bad stuff.
I like that image, by the way. That makes a lot of sense.
It really does kind of work that way. But yeah, these things pack a really big punch. If you look at this slide here, the power of waves, the lift and sink in these things can just be tremendous. And in the photograph on the left, my airspeed and altimeter are on the left-hand side there, and I'm again near my best glide speed. But you can clearly see all three hands of the altimeter. That's 21,000 feet. And in the upper right, my variometer is showing me, it looks like about an 800 foot per minute climb. So just tremendous power in these things. And the photograph on the right, let's see, here we've got the airspeed in the on the left-hand side, and in this case, the airspeed is extremely high. If we were flying in still air, we'd be in a steep dive. We've got the nose of this glider just mashed down. In the center, you've got the variometer, which is showing a 200 foot per minute climb. That's probably an anomaly because this photograph was taken on a milk run cross-country flight that we do from Minden to Verdi and back. And you'll notice the altimeter on the right-hand side, we're holding our VFR cruising altitude of 17,500 feet. So, and this is a two-person glider weighing about 13 to 1,400 pounds. And so, like I said, if we can do this without an engine, then light airplane pilots might be able to use this sort of stuff if they knew what they were doing.
So I gotta ask, and I know we've talked about this a little bit before, but you do a lot of high altitude glider flying. I know that obviously a lot of people here are not necessarily glider pilots, but tell me a little bit about, do you have to get a block from ATC or something like that when you decide either can't or are not intending on holding the under 18,000 foot altitude? How exactly does that work for you?
Now, there are a couple of ways to do that, actually. Carl Harold, who is probably passed away, I haven't seen him in years, but he used to do block clearances up and down the backside of the Sierras back in the 1960s. But the way we do it, what was done for these photographs, or for the photograph on the left, is we have something called a wave window. And a wave window is a written agreement between ATC and in our case, the Pacific Soaring Council, whereby if we have the conditions for wave soaring, we call down to the ground and somebody on the ground picks up the phone and calls ATC, says we want the wave window, and they'll grant us, you know, the wave window A up to and including flight level 260 through 5 p.m. Let us know when the last glider leaves. And so ATC basically sets aside a chunk of airspace for us to operate VFR in as gliders.
But you're still, even though you're in Class A airspace, you're still VFR essentially. And do you have transponders?
Transponders have not been required. It's a smart idea to have a transponder.
At 21,000 feet, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah. No, if the glider didn't have an electrical system, then it doesn't need a transponder, I don't believe. But yeah, so it's essentially a block of airspace that ATC sets aside for us to operate VFR above 18,000 feet. Yeah, so it's one of those quirky little rules.
And what's the highest altitude in a glider you've achieved?
My personal record is 25,400.
25,400 feet in a glider. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Now on that day, I easily could have exceeded 30,000, but I've always held my personal limit right around 25, 26, just because, you know, the time of useful consciousness gets to be short, and you know, I'm just less and less of a risk taker the older I get.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. So back to this. Let's talk about crossing ridges.
Yeah. Okay. So in talking about performance and weather, it's what we've got to work with versus what we're up against. Let's go ahead and put together some rules to live by. And when it comes to crossing a ridge, anything more than 20 knots of wind, if you're not local or really mountain experienced, you have to look at that as the same as a 200-foot overcast and you don't have an instrument rating. There's just so much possibility for you to get into trouble with mechanical lift and sink that it's probably just best if you wait the day out and launch the next day instead. But when you do cross a ridge, you want to approach it at a 45-degree angle. That's house rule number one. Always be in a position to turn toward lowering terrain. And then you can commit to crossing the ridge when the aircraft could glide to the ridge if you reduce the power to idle. That's house rule number two. Never fly past the point of no return. So when you get enough altitude to make the ridge line the point of no return, you're good to cross.
And when you mean glide to the ridge, I assume you mean glide over the ridge, get past the ridge.
Yeah, exactly. If the engine quit, am I going to hit the ridge is the question. So you want to get the point of no return past that ridge line. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And my advice is to clear the ridge for 2,000 feet for safety purposes. Now, if wave exists and you're a novice, you probably shouldn't be out flying. But if wave exists, that 2,000 foot rule is a little bit different. You want to clear it by half the mountain height. So, for example, down near Minden, Nevada, the top of the highest mountain is about 11,000 feet. The valley floor is about 5,000 feet. So the rise in the mountain's about 6,000 feet there, and half that would be 3,000 feet. So if you've got wave going on, you want to clear the ridge line by 3,000 feet in that case, just to make sure you're out of the worst of the turbulence. You know, that nasty stuff down in the roll clouds.
Got it.
Yeah. So, those are a couple of simple rules that ought to keep you safe. Ridgeline. Canyons, similar, and my graphic here is less than optimal. I kludged it a bit. But the common mistake people make with canyons is flying right down the center. And it's a mistake because you've limited your turning radius in either direction. So you want to pick one side or the other. All things being equal, I like to pick the right side just because it's like driving. If somebody's coming the other direction, we might have a better chance at missing at each other. But all things are usually not equal. And so you want to pick the downwind, typically the downwind side of the canyon, so you might have a chance at some mechanical lift. And also the eastern facing slope of the mountains usually gets the first heating of the day, and so there are quite often thermals there. And so picking one side or the other, especially if you get an advantage in lifting air, is the way to go. And the reasons, the extra reasons for that are that if you end up having to make a turnaround, if you turn into the wind, you decrease your turning radius because of the slower ground speed. You can take advantage of the lift, and by turning into the wind again, you don't have to make a full 180. You're crabbed into it to start and you're crabbed into it to finish, and so it's less than 180 degrees of turnaround. So yeah, just pick a side. This is a controversial topic. I've just quoted Sparky Imison in the Canyon turnaround. At or below maneuvering speed, use the steepest bank you're comfortable with, and you can use flaps to shorten the turning radius, but beware if there's turbulence, because lowering the flaps does decrease the airplane's ability to withstand a load factor. Yeah, I just quote Sparky on the Canyon turnaround because I've heard some bizarre answers. One guy advocated a hammerhead. Admittedly, he was a Pitts pilot, but yeah, I wouldn't advocate a hammerhead.
Yeah, I don't even know how to answer that one.
That was a joke.
Perhaps if you've gone for your commercial and understand chandelles and steep turns and want to start doing anything like that, but I think that's all a bit crazy.
That's true.
But in all seriousness, I mean, Colin, there have been some very landmark accidents by some very experienced pilots in canyons. I mean, we all know what happened to the Icon doing the same kind of thing. Turned up a dead end canyon, was not able to turn that aircraft around in time. Any tips on how you can judge the wind when you're doing that? What do you, other than what you know of, oh, here's my winds aloft and here's the direction of the canyon that I'm in, or something like that? Is it anything like what seaplanes pilots use where they look for a certain thing or anything like that?
For me, absent clues on the ground, like seeing the vegetation blowing. It's the airplane's crab angle and how it, how the flight path of the airplane is performing to what is normal to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the wind's crabbing me around, I'm gonna notice it. You just have to become sensitive to the airplane crabbing.
And when you talk about minimum maneuvering speed for that, are you talking about basically that roughly 1.4 stall speed without flaps, without gear, that kind of thing?
V sub A, maneuvering speed, VA.
As it's defined for your aircraft, the VA then.
Correct.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay, so I normally digress into a glider concept here called speed to fly. And again, for time constraints, I really had to butcher my slides a bit here. So I'm just going to quote a couple of places that people can go for a good treatment of this. First of all, Carl Conway's book, The Joy of Soaring, is the seminal text in the glider community. And he defines speed to fly as the indicated airspeed that produces the flattest glide in any situation of convection. Now, as airplane pilots, we're taught that when the engine quits, you fly the best glide speed, and that is the best speed to fly if the atmosphere was a glass of milk. However, if you're dealing with vertical convection, the appropriate speed to fly does change. And a great treatment of this is in the Bob Wander Made Easy series. He has a one called Glide Polars and Speed to Fly ... Made Easy. And I'm sure you can get it at Sporty's. It's only a couple dozen pages long, and it really gives you a thoughtful but simple approach to this important concept. Basically,
Can you define that book again? What's the book?
Let's see, Glide Polars and Speed to Fly Made Easy ... Made Easy, and it's by a fellow named Bob Wander, Wander. Really good treatment of the topic, and basically the concept here is that if you blunder into a really bad downdraft, it's not always the wisest thing to do to try and outclimb it. In other words, to go to your VY. Oftentimes, it's better to maintain maneuvering speed and try to fly your way out of it. And glider pilots really know this. They understand that when you're getting battered in a really bad downdraft, by pulling back on the yoke and going to VY and trying to fight a losing battle, out climbing something you can't possibly outclimb, you're better off just trying to fly out of it.
Right.
And this is what speed to fly is all about. It's a really important concept, and it's something that I've used a lot in my flying light airplanes around the mountains. So,
well, that's a real tactical thing, right, Colin? I mean, there's two things that we need to think of any time that we get ourselves into a tough situation when flying, and a variety of things. And one of them, of course, has to do with like how you operate the aircraft itself, like in a bubble, having the best climb rate, or having these other things that you've talked about, maneuvering speed, or VY if you're a powered aircraft. But it's another thing entirely about getting yourself out of the situation. I mean, one is if you think about it in terms of things like swimmers in a riptide. You can look at it at what's going to make you the most efficient swimmer to swim against the tide, but that's actually not how you save yourself. You save yourself by going across it as quickly as possible and getting out of it and saving yourself out of the situation entirely. And those are two different things. So if I understand you correctly, in some cases, it's not about getting to that you want to be at the safe structural speed for the aircraft, but it's not about getting at the best speed to fight that and climb as best possible. It may be very well about what's going to exit you from the risk as quickly as possible, even if you are descending quickly.
that is an outstanding analogy. I'm going to have to steal that, Jeff. Swimming against a riptide, that's a perfect analogy, because by fighting that losing battle, all you do is exhaust yourself and guarantee your demise. Whereas by flying perpendicular to it or swimming perpendicular to it, you're getting out of the situation. That's a great analogy.
Well, I just want to make sure I understood it correctly. So I'm glad that that is definitely the case.
Yeah. So I wanted to finish up by just talking about some basic emergency planning. You know, I think I alluded to it earlier, but have a survival kit. Have a basic first aid kit, axe, matches, signaling devices, so on and so forth. Some basic stuff, and especially water. I was giving a BFR once, and one of my standard questions is, tell me what the dumbest thing you ever did in an airplane was. And this guy had an incident, crashed into a ridgeline during mountain wave conditions, and he was actually on flight following at the time, and it still took rescue personnel 8 hours to get to him. So if that's the best case scenario, you don't want to face the worst. I always tell people, file a flight plan, make regular position reports, and have a survival kit with you, and plenty of water. The other thing is with regard to your route planning. Nowadays with GPS, it's tempting to go direct point to point, but that'll often take you over some of the highest, most inhospitable terrain, and so it's advisable to put lots of dog legs in your route and stay near the low-lying population centers and potential landable areas if you have a problem.
Definitely makes sense. No question about it.
Yeah, well, the other thing is by dog legging, if you add a 40-mile dog leg to your route, in a typical light GA airplane, that's only 20 minutes. And if it saves you from having to climb another 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 feet to get over high terrain, well, it might just be a push time-wise. So, really think about your route and don't be so fixated on point to point. If you do have to go down off airport, one of my favorite lines is, don't do anything heroic to save the airplane. If the important thing is saving the people on board, and we don't need to do anything heroic to save the insurance company's new airplane.
Right. Well, I always like to think about it as the step one in your emergency checklist is, okay, the insurance company owns the airplane. Step two.
Exactly. So
step one, I'm serious. Step one mentally is, this is no longer my plane. Step two, what do I do to save everybody on board?
Yep, exactly. So the hazards here are failing to accept the situation, an undue desire to save the aircraft, and don't worry about getting hurt until the time comes. Let's fly the airplane. Don't stop flying until the airplane stops, or as Bob Hoover used to say, fly it as far into the crash as you can. The photograph here, incidentally, was one of our guys coming out of the Cody convention. I think in
I was there.
Yeah, I think it was Y2K. Really super experienced pilot, and the mountains just snuck up on him this day. It was really unfortunate and really too bad, but he and his passenger walked away from this just fine. So
I would say, as as former technical director of the someone's got the loud. As former technical director of the German Association, and having been to that thing, it is a testament to that aircraft that they walked away from the crash that you see right there.
Yeah. And you notice the cabin in the background. I think they broke into it and stayed there for a while, and the people who own the cabin sent them flowers in the hospital. I can't remember the story now, but yeah, nice people all around. So
yeah, there are there's some excellent work and writings out there and studies about essentially how to safely crash an aircraft. It's not a subject a lot of people like to think about, but it's pretty important, and it is remarkable what a short distance is really required to preserve human life in a crash. And and the key is in essentially having distance for deceleration. Anything that gives you that minimum distance to decelerate instead of hitting something flat on, makes a radical difference to it, and that's important for what we have here.
Agreed. Yeah.
Colin, I'm getting some noise back there. Just
Okay. Yeah. That's as I said, I am at the airport, so let me see if I can turn that off. Okay, that should be better. Are you there, Jeff?
yeah, but the volume's very low.
Okay, sorry. I'll try and speak up. Rules, some basic final rules to live by. Know what the density altitude is and really be familiar with your aircraft's performance and what it's going to do. That's first and foremost. As I said, with regard to route planning, stay near the low-lying areas and population centers. Get airborne at dark 30 and be in the pool at your destination by lunchtime. Fly early in the day. And stay on the ground if the winds are strong and you're not familiar or not local, because I just can't say it often or strongly enough. 20, 25, 30 knot winds over the Sierra Nevada can be as hazardous as a 200-foot overcast to a non-instrument rated pilot. So maybe stay an extra day, enjoy the scenery, and wait until the winds die down before you depart.
Makes sense. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm going to switch over now to webcam, take some of your questions and fire them here. Colin doesn't have access to a webcam, so he'll be just on audio again, which is why he's been audio for this presentation. So we'll see if we can get a few of these questions answered. Feel free to submit them here. And the first one is, I want to make sure everybody understands, we've gotten a fair number of questions about wings credit. When you attend tonight's broadcast, you entered in your email, and that will be used to give you credit for wings, and Colin will take care of working that out afterwards. So no worries there, and we can always follow up afterwards to make sure that that actually happens. First question has to do with time of year. Is there, when someone looks at going out west and planning a vacation, is there a certain time of year that you recommend, Colin?
Oh gosh, well, we definitely have 4 seasons, and the winter months can be difficult because we get our share of snow. So you know that can always make things a little extra hard. But generally speaking, spring and fall are really mild. We do get our hot days in the summer, but you know, if you're flying nice and early, dark 30, anything but the dead of winter is beautiful and flyable.
We're going to be good when we head out there towards August. Is that going to be an okay time to visit?
Oh yeah, that'd be it's going to be hot. I'll tell you. I'll warn you of that. But yeah, it'll be fine. We can have mountain wave any time of the year.
Got it.
That's a 4-season thing. All it takes is a stable layer and the appropriate wind conditions, and there you go.
Got it.
And really the same with thermals. I had a soaring flight about 15 years ago where the max temperature was in the 40s. I think it might have been as low as 41, because I terminated the flight because my feet were 2 blocks of ice. But we had thermals that day, and it was totally soarable. I think I stayed up an hour and a half just for kicks.
Wow.
So all it takes is an unstable atmosphere and differential heating, and you've got thermals. Boom. Right. I think that flight was in November. So yeah, it is possible to get these weather phenomena most of the year. And like I said, aside from the dead of winter, because of the snow, most of the year is flyable. We get you know, lots and lots of VFR days per year, as do the Rockies. Jackson Hole is a great place to fly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now,
so.
if planning a flight out there is, let's say you're coming from the East Coast, let's say you're going out to Reno or Yellowstone or right somewhere, Salt Lake City.
Oh yeah.
Is that all? Do you have to have oxygen on board in order to safely plan a flight to do that for a general aviation pilot?
Well, that's, you know, so that's part of the talk I cut out, and it's possible to get high altitude training at various military bases and in the United States, and there's also a program called PROTE, P-O-R-T-E, Portable Reduced Oxygen Training Enclosure. So this is really good training to get because everybody's response to hypoxia is different. It's like your personal symptoms of alcohol intoxication. Everybody has different symptoms. And so it's good to get to know your own and good to get to know your own tolerance. And of course, a good pulse oximeter is a good idea.
Yep, absolutely.
But yeah, it's obviously not required unless you're spending a lot of time above 12,005 or 14. But it's recommended above 10,000 feet. And at night, because of the night vision, it's recommended above 5,000 feet. So my home airport, Reno Stead, is 5,050 feet, or 50-50 as we say. And so you take off out of here at night, and the recommendation and the aim is that you use oxygen.
Right.
So,
which
yeah,
is more important at night for your eyesight, basically. I mean, it's not that the oxygen itself has a different effect. It's just that, of course, at night you rely on your low light vision, which is more affected by oxygen than you might be during the day. So you're right, that's pretty important.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't make that point clearly enough, but yeah, that's the first thing to go when you have a low oxygen environment. So yeah, hence the lower altitude.
Absolutely. What about planning the route when you think about canyons versus staying at high altitude? Canyons, mountain passes, things like that. I mean, if you were helping someone plan a route out, is that recommended to be trying to look for and go through all those passes for staying at lower altitudes on their route?
Actually, probably the best thing to do is to pick a major highway and plan your route around that.
Really?
Yeah, Highway 80 is a fantastic back and forth through the Rockies and the Sierras. If you're going up north, like to Yellowstone or Jackson Hole or Oshkosh. If you're going to Sun and Fun from where I live, you want to drop down south and follow Highway 40, the old Route 66, because those highways are built through low-lying areas, and so it's pretty easy to traverse altitude-wise.
Yep.
And you got a nice long runway if something goes wrong with the engine. So.
Right. That makes sense too. Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm gonna pull a couple things on my screen here so I can actually so I can bring up some more questions here. But that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
Yeah, those are my two favorite routes: Highway 80 and Highway 40. So.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, the risk is essentially when you do that, you're essentially doing mountain, canyon flying when you do that, and that's something that you're basically okay with.
Yeah, I know you can do the Highway 80 route at 8,500 feet safely. So it's pretty low level. You don't really get into any serious high terrain unless you venture away from the highway.
Got it. One of the other things to consider for anyone who's looking at taking a trip out there is, we're talking a lot about blood oxygen levels, oxygen saturation, and the importance of flying at altitude. And I'll tell you, a pulse oximeter is incredibly important for that. I happen to fly. I'll actually show it to you. This is Massimo's MightySat, and you can actually see the unit here in the box. We've worked with Massimo here at SocialFlight for quite a while. It's a great unit, and I'll tell you, one of the things that I've found, and Colin, you've flown with this as well, right? The Massimo?
Yeah, I have a Massimo MightySat myself.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there are certain areas that you don't want to really cheap out on, and you can find all sorts of knockoff pulse oximeters on eBay and on the internet. I have tested them, and I've tested them against this. Massimo happens to be a medical device company, and not only is it a very high quality unit, but it actually interfaces with your phone, has an app, etc., that goes along with it. And so I will say from experience that it's incredibly accurate and easy to use. I would never fly above, actually what we're finding is that you can get affected even over 6,000 feet for some people if you've tested yourself in the PROTE chamber. It's remarkable when you start to get affected, but no altitude, certainly above that 10,000 feet. I always want to keep track of what's happening with my blood oxygen level. Anything to add about that, Colin?
Well, the other thing about the MightySat that I love is the history that it keeps. You know, I know when I'm having an off day because I've got like a year's worth of history now, having used it. So
that's funny.
Yeah, but I couldn't agree more. I really enjoy it. It gives me a lot of good data, and as they say, better data, better health. Is the
Yeah, I'm actually looking at the unit now to see some of this, so I can kind of show people. We'll see if it starts to pick up some data. It's very impressive that it can do that, and this will actually show you. It's got a color screen on it. Sends all this information to your phone, gives you very accurate data. And of course, I just put it on here, so this is going to adjust very quickly and start rising up with my rate and give you accurate information. But like you said, it keeps a log of it, etc. So not meant to really just be an ad or something of that, but I think it's very important. If you're going to be doing this kind of mountain flying, you got to be monitoring yourself, and you have to know what your own norms are. So definitely check it out. And again, it's called the MightySat, and also, of course, they are a supporter here at SocialFlight. Let's see about any other questions that we've got here. Let's see. One person pointed out that there seems to be a little bit of difference in opinions on flying on the upwind side of a canyon versus the downwind, simply about seeing the effects of the downwind first rather than turning into them when you need to. Any thoughts on that, Colin?
That's a good point, actually. I can't disagree with it. I suppose this is a situation of 6 of one, half dozen of another. What's your preference? I totally see that logic, though, and that makes sense to me. You're turning into the sinking air.
Well, can you basically get the best of both worlds if while you're in a safe part of that canyon, you go and see what that downwind side is like, but fly your route on the the upwind side, but fly it on the downwind side that's giving you lift. Because I still believe that ability to be flying into the wind during your critical turn, if you have to get out, is pretty important.
Yeah, I agree. That's my philosophy. Obviously, is I would rather be turning into the wind and shorten my turning radius and not have to turn the full 180 degrees potentially.
Okay.
And I'll deal with the sinking air as it comes. So,
right.
I mean, the stronger the wind, the stronger the sink, but also the shorter your turning radius.
What about as far as like emergency equipment beyond the ones that you listed there, personal gear? Personally, I've got an ACR Artex 406 ELT. People fly with personal locator beacons as well. I can't imagine recommending to anyone at this point in time, if you're still only have a 121.5 ELT on board, you really got to think about what it's worth to you and your family to be stuck with that, because the difference in time between that and a 406 for rescue is remarkable.
Yeah, I think what you're doing here is you're pointing out that my slide is outdated. Yeah, I think
unintentional.
Personal locator, all that stuff is a great idea. I totally agree, and yeah, I need to update my my bullet points here.
All right. Well, before we run completely out of time here, the last thing, Colin, if you could, any advice for people in terms of other good schools to start to learn this? If you want anything else you'd like to list as far as further materials for people?
Well, let's see. The Colorado Pilots Association does a multi-day course. Last I checked, and they are one of the gold standards of mountain flying. Great organization, well thought out. I've never taken such a course myself, but the syllabus looks great, and I would highly recommend that. Another thing, I'm not sure if I'm out of line in mentioning this, but I'll take a chance. This material, my full talk, was published on the Lightspeed blog.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely sure.
Yeah, as a 5-part series, and so the rumor I hear is that they're going to publish it in the next few weeks as an ebook, And so if people want to go to the Lightspeed, lightspeedaviation.com, the Lightspeed site, and register for their newsletter, you'll get the announcement as to when that eventually gets published.
Yes.
We're going to have an ebook series.
And for everybody else out there, of course, all the SocialFlight live broadcasts are recorded and available on our YouTube channel. Just search for SocialFlight, one word, SocialFlight, on YouTube. Subscribe. You'll get all the different recordings of SocialFlight live programs, as well as all the other things that we do as well. And so with that, we are out of time. Colin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening on SocialFlight Live.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Sorry about my technical limitations, but such is life when you're rural.
No worries at all. No worries. I appreciate that. We've certainly learned a lot. Again, you can find those slides. We'll have the whole presentation up there for you, and many, many more things to come. Feel free to send us your feedback, the types of things that you'd like to see from future shows. We will be back next week on Tuesday here at SocialFlight Live with Dan Schwinn of Avidyne. We're going to talk about his background and the entire evolution of Avidyne, their products, where they came from, and that story. Another inspirational opportunity for us to learn the story of some of the people that have made general aviation what they are today. Following that, on July 14th, then again, another Tuesday at 8 p.m., we have Ryan Reed and Brian Braun of U Avionics, another kind of new company that has come and just taken general aviation by storm. I absolutely love it when all of these companies invest in general aviation, and we're going to get to learn about all of their products, both new and some of the classic ones that we've had. And again, the story, where these people came from, what got them into general aviation, and what's happening, and been their view on the industry, especially during this time of crisis. We then take a week off, and we will be back at the end of July, July 28th, with Mike Bush, and we are going to talk about aircraft diagnostics. In other words, how to go and stress test your engine while you're flying, learn what's happening, learn how to track down problems. It's going to be another fantastic evening. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon for SocialFlight. Thank you so much for joining us. Blue skies.